sa présence parmi nous. Comme l'un des organisateurs le disait, c'est important de parler de l'Autriche. On parle plus souvent de l'Allemagne et je pense que c'est important pour vous, dans le cadre de cette semaine européenne, de s'ouvrir des perspectives et de mieux comprendre cette variété d'acteurs dans l'Europe. Donc je vous remercie encore de votre présence. Je vais vous laisser. Merci beaucoup à tous.
Good morning, everyone, dear students, dear Andreas Lins. It's a pleasure for us to begin this fourth day of the European Week. We are very pleased to see you today for beginning this conference about Austrian diplomacy and security policy in a European context. You can see the topic right here, Austria, its naturalist tradition and the security challenge in Europe. Several questions appear here, such as the place of Austria in Europe taken by crises, like migratory or ecological one, or the impact of neutralist policy during conflicts. To answer our questions, we have the pleasure to receive the Consul General Andreas Lins. Thank you for being here.
First and foremost, we will start this conference with a quick introduction of Sir Andreas Lins. So you started your diplomatic career at the Federal Ministry for European and International Affairs in Vienna. Then you became a European law writer at the International Law Office and worked with NATO before becoming a deputy of mission at the Austrian General Consulate in Los Angeles and in the Embassy of Tel Aviv. In 2018, you were head of department for border control, anti-human trafficking and visa appeals, and in 2020, you were political advisor to the president of the National Council, which is the Austrian Parliament. Finally, since the 30th September 2022, you've held the position of General Counsel of Austria in Strasbourg and Deputy Permanent Representative of Austria to the Council of Europe. So it's a real pleasure for us to have you with us today. We will now move on to the dialogue format and then we will take questions from the audience. Thank you.
So after this warm introduction, also a very warm welcome from my side. As already said, I am the Austrian Consul General here in Strasbourg and I am the Austrian Deputy Representative at the Council of Europe, which sounds a little bit schizophrenic because I work as Austrian diplomat in France, but I also work as Austrian diplomat for the Council of Europe. So I am one of the diplomats who see the bilateral relations and the multilateral relations at the same time, which is a good and a bad thing. The bad thing is it costs more time. The good thing is you get more insight and can connect the dots. Having said that, I was told that most of you are students here in the second year, but there are also a few exchange students in the room and probably some Austrians. But we are not sure. So, but if, as an Austrian diplomat, of course, I'm interested to know if there are any Austrians in the room. So if there are, please identify yourself. Okay, I take this as a no. Very good. Probably, again, a short introduction from my side. I will just follow up on what our host said. A few of you might be interested in what it's like of being a diplomat or having a diplomatic career. As you do right now, I studied in Austria and in France. I did my studies in Paris and in Innsbruck in Austria. And after studying, I started as a stagiaire in the Austrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and from there on took the concours and became an Austrian diplomat. And being a diplomat basically means, apart from being a regular civil servant, that you get posted every 3 to 4 or 5 years to a different country and different posting. In my case, I by chance, honestly, started focusing my career in the beginning on security policy, and started on working at NATO and on the common foreign security policy of the European Union. After that, I changed my track completely and moved to the Netherlands to become there the deputy at the Austrian Consul General for the Western United States, and worked on consular affairs, the relations of Austria with Austrian Jews who were persecuted during World War II and subsequently had to move to the west coast of the United States. And after that, I moved to Tel Aviv and became there the Austrian Deputy Ambassador in Israel, working for 4 years there. And before coming to Strasbourg in September of last year, I was the foreign policy advisor to the President of the Austrian Parliament. So, in a very, very brief nutshell, this sums up my professional career. And I think that I was told that some of you and our host have prepared some questions. So before I dive into what I have prepared, it might be beneficial if we start with your questions, because I'm here to serve your questions and to entertain your questions and not have a boring monologue which you think afterwards, why did you talk about this and not what I'm really interested in. So I suggest that probably you start and then I go ahead.
Well, our first question will be, could you please sum up the history of Austria, its political and legal aspects, and especially the background of this history?
History as a... Austria has quite some history.
The history of Austria, and especially like for its politic and security history.
Okay, so Austria, I mean, for the sake of finishing in time and not taking until tomorrow, we start. We all know World War I ended. We had the period between the world wars. World War II started. World War II, with all its atrocities, which Austria was part of and part of the German Reich, came to an end. And then the Second Republic, which is still the Republic of today, started emerging in Austria. With you to understand the politics of the Second Republic, it's important to understand what happened in World War II. So I assume, being here in front of political students, this is something I assume everybody of you knows, and you also have an idea about the role of Austria and the Austrian population in World War II, meaning Austria ceased to exist, but its population was part of German Reich, meaning Austrians were drafted into the Wehrmacht, into the SS, and for all intents and purposes, we were considered a German Reich. Which also means that a lot of Austrians were persecuted, a lot of Austrian Jews perished in the Holocaust, a lot of Austrians were not only victims, but a huge number of Austrians were also on the evil side, so to say, and which is very important to understand that this is something which is part of our history, and that that it's important that we as Austrians acknowledge this and not as something that this is something Germany did or the Germans did, but we were an integral part of the war machinery of World War II. After World War II, it's important to understand that, as in Germany, Austria was occupied by the Allied forces, France being one of them. I was born in the very west of Austria, which was then part of the French zone, which leads to the fact that until today, in the village where I'm coming from, that there is the Rue de Marocain, Rue des Algériens, Rue des Français. So because the soldiers from these countries were just garrisoned around, and
they left traces, and they stayed there for roughly 10 years. Why 10 years? And this is something which is important to understand, where history really took a different path in Austria than in Germany. In 1955, after long negotiations, it was agreed that all Allied forces leave Austria and one unified Austria become a fully independent state. So the French left for France, the Americans for America, the British for Britain, and important, because this was already the beginning of the Cold War, the Soviet Red Army left for the Soviet Union. And this is probably something we can elaborate a little bit further, especially in today's time, that Austria is one of the few countries in Europe where the Red Army has been stationed, and they left without a single shot, and they actually did what they told they will do. So it was agreed upon that on a certain date in 1955, all soldiers leave, and also the Soviet Red Army actually left. And this is very important to understand if you hear today discussions about the position of various European states when it comes to their experience with the Russian army or then the Soviet army. I think it's not an exaggeration to say a lot of countries to the east of France have more or less difficult experiences, to put it diplomatically. Austria is one of the few countries where, of course, there were difficulties during the time they were there, but on a larger scale, the experiences Austria as a country had with the Soviet Union after World War II and with the Red Army were completely different than the experiences a lot of other countries had. So after 1955, Austria also, and this is where the story of Austria and then Germany completely develops differently, is unified. There is no division between East and West. There is one Austria. Austria also immediately joins the United Nations in December 1955. So we are considered a full member in, so to say, good standing of the international community. And as you probably know, both Germany became a member of the United Nations only decades later. And also in 1956, we became a member of the Council of Europe here in Strasbourg. So from a political point of view, after 1956, Austria was an internationally well-connected European state with normal diplomatic relations, which was deeply invested in the western part of Europe, but still being a neutral country. I think this is very important to understand the history, and I think this is where I want to stop for the moment. And then, because the story between what happened in France and what happened in Austria is quite similar. If I understand the expression correctly, in France it's called la Trente Glorieuse, or la Glorieuse Trente. So these years of development were basically the same in Austria. So there was a huge economic uptick, people got richer, the country got richer, there was elections were free and fair, various parties had the head of government and head of state. So there was never a question if Austria falls back into a communist zone or becomes a more non-democratic state, even while being neutral. So from the mindset of the time, neutrality, which should be explained, was part of being independent and was seen as essential of the acceptance of the Soviet Union to leave Austria. And this is very important to understand. was something that was seen as a model of success. So in 1955, Austria declared its neutrality voluntarily. By law, it became constitutional law, and in the years before 1955, this is something that really has to be understood. It became clear that the status of neutrality was something because of the rise of the Cold War. The Allied forces at the end agreed, because then they thought if Austria stays neutral and does not become part of NATO from the point of view of the Soviet Union, or does not become part of the Warsaw Pact from the side of everybody else, this is something they can accept, and it's a better solution from their point of view than basically do what happened in Germany and splitting the country up in two parts.
So you just said that neutrality has been a constitutional principle since 1955. We could say that neutrality is almost part of the Austrian identity. Is neutrality still important as before? What about today?
Yes, I mean, this is a very important and for Austrian politicians sensitive topic. And this would be something I would be interested also hear from you, how you see this as somebody who is a French national or has an experience of living in France. There are certain laws, even constitutional laws, that become, from a political or a political science view, more than laws. It's nothing you follow strictly because it's law, but it's something that becomes part of identity. It becomes a little bit, even more than identity, it becomes a little bit of folklore. People even stop thinking about something like a law, but more as something which is just part of being Austrian or being French. And with neutrality, this is something that exactly what happened with neutrality in Austria. As just mentioned, neutrality was something which Austria, we didn't have neutrality like Switzerland for hundreds of years. Imagine until 1918, we were a huge empire which basically started World War I in Bosnia-Herzegovina after our Archduke was shot by Serbian nationalists. So this means we don't have this century-old tradition of being neutral between two blocks. The reason that Swiss neutrality actually started, I'm sure you all know, has to do with the fact that it was geographically placed between France and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. So both agreed that having a neutral state in between was a good thing. And with this, basically neutrality, which was negotiated between the Allied powers after World War II and Austria, there is this psychological effect that over the years and decades this became something 100% positive, which Austrians identify as something typical Austrians and which is of benefit for Austria. Because they see that in 1955 we gained our independence, we gained our complete freedom of making our own political choices because of declaring neutrality. So you have now 3 generations who saw neutrality as something giving them back political freedom. And the price we had to pay was, from their point of view, a very minimal one, because you always have the comparison to Switzerland. Meaning, it's hard to argue that Switzerland suffers because it's neutral, it actually benefits Switzerland. So this happened, the same happened in Austria. In Austria, we were completely integrated in the Western market. We traded with every NATO country, with every member of the European community. We became a member of the European Free Trade Association. But because we were neutral, we also could trade with this bloc, with the Soviet Union. For example, Austria had like areas here in the area had at that time a huge industry in metallurgy, so it was quite obvious for us that we import iron ore not from places far between, but we imported it from today's Ukraine. It's relatively close. You take a ship by the Danube and the stuff is here. Or coal, because we also had iron ore in Austria, so you could mix it in Austria. You import the coal from the Soviet Union, you have the iron ore in Austria, you mix it at a port that is accessible by a barge and a train, and you produce steel. So these were good ideas. The same goes, for example, that in the 60s there were in Europe huge polio epidemics. And in the Soviet Union, they already invented a vaccination against it. And Austria was the first country outside of the Soviet Union bloc which got the Soviet-made polio vaccination because we were neutral. So these are all these things where it's hard to argue that being neutral is a disadvantage. Also, we started seeing politically that Vienna became a hub of diplomacy. A few of you might already have classes about the history of Europe and Cold War after World War II. So the first big talks between Khrushchev and Kennedy, they were all held in Vienna. It's not because it's beautiful or logistically easy to get there, but it was a country with both superpowers at the time agreed. It's safe to go there, and it's politically neutral enough to not make a statement that we are simply there. And so this develops that, I don't know if there is anybody here who studies international law, but the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, or the Vienna Conventions on Consular Relations, they regulate the bilateral relations between nations until today. They are called Vienna Convention because they were a conference over years in Vienna, and they were in Vienna because it was considered a neutral place where everybody who agrees on nothing, they still can meet. And so Vienna became also, next to Geneva and New York, the third headquarter of the United Nations. And a little bit later, it also became the headquarters of the OSCE and the IAEO. All organizations that are very important until today, and where you also have a link to Strasbourg with the European Parliament and the Council of Europe. So I think this is also something we can discuss, while certain organizations ended up in Strasbourg and others in Vienna or in Geneva.
Yeah, exactly. Could you tell us why, in your opinion, are these institutions, like in Vienna but also in Strasbourg, essential for the stability of diplomacy in Europe and in the entire world?
I mean, the reason why an organization is important is always something which lies in the judgment lies in the beholder. Meaning, I'm sure if you ask a diplomat about the importance of the Council of Europe, his reply might be different in the 1960s or in 2023. But never mind, and this is also true for the OSCEs, but I think international organizations are always created because a group of nations agree that they need an organization to fulfill a cause. Typically, organizations are never created because somebody said, let's create an organization, but because there is a problem that everybody agrees has to be dealt with in an institutional framework. Be it even the United Nations, in the conference of San Francisco, it was agreed upon that creating the United Nations is something after World War II which is desirable. And the same goes for the Council of Europe. Where it gets a little bit complicated is with the organizations in Vienna. And I don't know if you realize, but organizations in Strasbourg, it's hard to argue that France is a neutral country, And it's hard to argue why somebody would agree to place an organization in a country which has a very strong foreign policy tradition, is a global player and has a seat in the permanent, a permanent seat in the Security Council. So this is a very powerful country. But in my experience, organizations in Strasbourg or in Paris tend to be organizations which are like-minded. Meaning, in the moment they are created, everybody agrees on the cause and everybody agrees on the direction. The Council of Europe, when it was created, everybody agreed that democracy, rule of law, and human rights is something good and something that should be supported, which is why we need this, to put it very roughly. Yeah? At the OSCE in Vienna, things are a little bit different, and they have always been different. The OSCE was created out of the Chart of Helsinki, which was basically the product of the Soviet Union and the Americans agreeing on certain rights issues and on certain control issues when it comes to weapons of mass destruction. So this is hardly a topic where you agree on anything, but it is something where you agree to disagree and to make sure it's in our interest to avoid World War III, but that's about it. So, and if you create an organization where Soviet Union and the United States of America agree on doing something, probably it's harder for France to convince them to do it in France. So it's easier for them to agree on setting this organization up in a smaller country, which is a little bit more neutral, or is completely neutral, and because then you don't have to, the idea that this country wants to play their national interests via these organizations, which I don't know, probably a lot of you follow the developments around Ukraine, is exactly now in this week and in the coming weeks the case with OSCE. OSCE has a parliamentary assembly which meet, as does the Council of Europe, and they meet once in winter, once in summer, and the winter session is held in Vienna. OSCE is a member, the Russian Federation is a member of OSCE. So the question remains, how does Austria issue visas to Russian members of the Duma who are on a sanctioned list? Complicated question. But nobody doubts that they are the representative of the Russian Federation, and Russia is still a member of OSCE. So the Austrian position is very clear. This is not a question of choice or of foreign politics of Austria, but we have a legal obligation as the host nation of the OSCE to do everything we have to do to make the OSCE work. And as long as Russia is a member of OSCE, we don't have to interpret the actions of a member of the Duma of Russia, but if he gets nominated to be part of the Russian delegation, he has the right to visit the seat of the Parliamentary Assembly, which happens to be in Vienna. You can imagine that Ukraine is not particularly happy. But these are the situations that develop, and you also can imagine that Russia is not particularly happy that our foreign minister even addressed this and made sure that it's understood that it's not a question that to be interpreted as like that Austria supports a particular Russian position, but it's just a question of law that as a host nation we have to fulfill. These are the questions when it becomes complicated, and also, as you know, France has to deal with when it comes to the Council of Europe, where Russia no longer is a member, but where Russia still is a member of certain conventions, and you have to find a way on how to communicate with a member of a treaty or a convention in a legal way and still respecting certain sanctions and your national position. So this is for diplomats and foreign ministers. This can be challenging times and challenging questions from the journalists and from the wider public.
Thank you. So we talked about not just this tradition, but also the importance of Austria with Vienna like a hub of diplomacy. What is Austria's real capacity for action in Europe, and what role does Austria play in Europe, for example, when we talk about security challenges?
I mean, when it comes to the role we play in Europe, historically speaking, in 1990, we have to be precise. What is Europe? If you have an answer, let me know. Typically, we tend to speak when it comes about and use the term Europe quite unprecisely. Sometimes we mean the European Union, sometimes we mean the Council of Europe, sometimes we mean basically everything between Lisbon and Vladivostok. It depends on what we want to see in this expression. So Austria always made sure to have a definition of Europe which is inclusive. We don't like the idea that everything that happened in Europe is seen as only as a business within the European Union, which means we are a strong supporter historically of the integration of the countries of the European East into the structures of the European Union, into the structures of the Council of Europe. Today, for example, there is still one country who wants to become a member of the Council of Europe, which is not a member in Southeast Europe, which is Kosovo. So we think this is something that has to be addressed. We also think that there are clear European perspectives for Ukraine, which does not mean that European perspectives for Ukraine are the same like next year Austria wants to see Ukraine as a member of the European Union. So there is a reason why all countries who became a member of Europe had to fulfill certain criteria. We don't see a reason why now the world is different when it comes to these criteria. But we also think that Europe, again, this is where our perspective as a neutral country comes in. We are quite frank when in our discussions and saying Russia will not stop being on the map. It's not a question if you like it or not, it's geography. So you can do whatever you want, but there will be a capital called Moscow, and there will be a country around Moscow called Russian Federation. And this does not say anything about the political system. This does not say anything about the form of government, but just ignoring the fact that the biggest country in the world sits on the border of the European Union and trying to exclude this country from everything that has to do with the expression of Europe is something we deem very, very complicated, and we think, as Austria, we have to find a way to have an outreach to this country, to make sure that certain means and ways of dialogue remain open. Again, this does absolutely not mean that we support at the moment anything which is happening in Ukraine or which is happening in the Kremlin. It's square and fair that everything which happens in the Ukraine at the moment is something that started in the Kremlin. It's not that it's our position that just one small dot of what Vladimir Putin is saying concerning Ukraine is true. But I think we all have to be realistic and just read a map and see that to the northeast of Ukraine, it's not white, but there is something written. There are towns and villages in the capital, and as diplomats in states, and if I understand this correct, you will be the future part of French administration and European administration. We all have to find ways to discuss with people not only we agree with, that's the easy part, but to find ways of discussing with people we don't agree with, or which other countries which we have friendly relations with are actually at war. And I think this is the challenge when it comes at the moment to Europe. And I think this is something where Austria, with its history, its role, its thinking, can provide an added value, while still always understanding why other countries have a completely different position. And this is also something which is important, that the way I talk, I don't talk because I don't understand where certain countries are coming from. If you were ruled by Moscow, so to say, as a country in certain parts of Europe, and if you vanished to exist, and your country only became completely independent after the fall of the Iron Curtain, it's obvious that the point of view you are having might be different because your experiences are different. But still, I think then also in an inner European dialogue, we have to find a middle ground, because if we all tend to go to extremes, history teaches us that typically this doesn't end too well for Europe.
Thank you for this very complete answer. You talked about a potential enlargement of the European Union. So, and we know that Austria wants to deepen the relations with the Balkans. What would you say to some states who think that the European Union is running out of steam because of the recent enlargements?
I mean, this is a little bit an elitist problem, I think. I mean, the situation we are having right now when it comes to the European Union is that there are a lot of fields in the European Union where things are going reasonably to excellent, reasonably well to excellent, but these tend to be topics nobody reads in the news about, or nobody understands because they are highly technical. And then you have all the topics where unanimity is needed in the Council. And unanimity means that you need one minister who actually, for any reasons, he does not have to give a reason, by the way, just says no. And then the whole dossier is blocked. And at the time, this seems to be in a lot of, in the field of foreign policy, the European governments quite often hit a roadblock because one country or another country does not agree with what the others are saying. Honestly speaking, if we talk about an accession of countries in Southeast Europe, I don't think that the dynamic will change. Just if you look at the size of these countries and their economy, it's not like we are discussing Brexit or something similar. These tend to be tiny countries with GDPs that is, compared to France, minimal. But and I also don't think that when it comes to unanimity, that these countries might have a position which is completely out of question to what we are discussing right now. But yes, I agree that the institutional framework of the European Union, as it is right now, was probably made at a time when fewer countries with politics that aligned with war was drafted, and now we have a lot more countries with governments which have much more or more diverse views on a lot of sensitive issues.
So this is challenging. But from a point of view of countries in the southeast of Europe, I tend to, if I play the advocate for them, I would say, why is this my problem? If I am the North Macedonia, for example, and I only want to mention this country, they agreed on a treaty with Greece. They are working with Bulgaria, which is complicated, point taken. They changed a lot of things. They try to do what the European Commission asks them to do. And the best we can tell them is wait, because now we have a war in Ukraine and we have a problem with our institutions. I think this is not really first of all, it's not fair, but I understand fair is not a category, but it's also not wise for the European Union, because diplomacy as science does not like vacuums. Meaning, if we don't do anything on the Balkans, other countries and other international players will do something in the Balkans. And this is something we always tell our friends who are skeptics. Either it's us who take care of certain questions, or somebody else will take care of the question, and then you have to deal with other players you don't like, probably. So what do you prefer? Having a problem within the European Union which has to be solved? Or do you want to have countries who align themselves with other powers you have bigger geostrategic problems with? And this is why we think really that Western Balkans and Southeast Europe, it's in the interest of Europe, it's in the interest of France, not to be forgotten. And this is not of something of doing a favor. It should be our national interest that these countries, they feel the pressure to integrate, they feel the pressure to follow European law, they feel the pressure to follow European values. Will we succeed? I don't know. Will these countries even be interested? I have no idea. Certain politicians in the Western Balkans are quite frank that the European Union is for them a mere option, but other options might be more attractive. But I think we as member states of the European Union, we have to be clear and show them that we are not only telling them you can have your accession talks, or you actually you can, in the case of Kosovo, you can travel for visa-free in a distant future, but that it is obvious that we can tell them and their population that there is a clear perspective for a European path.
Thank you. Before you used the word challenges, I think Balkans are one of them. But I think that we could say migration is also an important topic for Austria. As we saw it during the presidency of EU Council by Austria, for example, in the past year. Recently, the numbers of migrants in Europe has increased, especially in Austria. What is Austria's position on these changes? What about Europe? What can we expect in the coming years for Austrian and European policy about migration?
Well, when it comes to European policy, I think we have to wait 2 days because now the European Council in Brussels, the head of governments, they are preparing their statements, and I think so there should be something in concerning migration. Migration is a very, very challenging topic for Austria, because we are in the very top of European Union countries when it comes to the arrivals of migrants, and especially of illegal migrants. What do I mean? In France and in Spain and Italy, there is often the impression that everybody who arrives illegally in the European Union arrives by boat via the Mediterranean and lands somewhere between the coast of the Adriatic Sea, the French Mediterranean, and somewhere to Gibraltar. reality, a big part of migrants who arrive inside the European Union arrive via the Western Balkans. So they travel via Turkey just to the northwest and cross various countries on their way. And then the rest is mathematics and looking into the GDP per person per country. So it's not very surprising if you're a migrant from India or Afghanistan and you made your way to the Western Balkans that you aim for going a little bit further and not stop where you are right now. And it happens to be that if you look on the GDP per person, Austria is a country which has a substantial higher GDP per person than a lot of its neighbors to the east and southeast, which makes us a little bit more attractive. Just a logical choice. I think all of us would do the same. And that's challenging because as Austria we have the approach that human rights have to be fulfilled, meaning if somebody requests asylum in Austria, this means this person has the right that its asylum claim has to be looked into. This takes time. This means this person has to be housed. This person needs a stipend to live on until his or her claims are finally decided. If the claims are decided and if the judge deems there is no claim for asylum, this person has to be moved back to its home country, which in today's world is almost impossible. As we all know, if you cannot bring anybody against its will back to Syria and back to Afghanistan, this just does not work. So this provides a challenge for our politicians because we have tens of thousands of people arriving who are de facto not refugees in the term of the Human Rights Conventions, but who are migrants who migrate for economic reasons, which again is completely understandable, but which does not make them refugees. And we have to deal with a situation which we never have had to deal with. For politicians, the problem is politicians have to, every 4 years they have to go to elections. So, and you know how these things work, in France. They have to explain their voters what they did right and what they did wrong. And Austrians don't understand why they need a passport if they travel to somewhere, and why somebody who arrives here without anything, without saying anything, without proving a citizenship, has to be housed and fed and by someone, by their taxpayers' money. This is very challenging, and this provides politicians in a spot which is very uncomfortable because human rights law are universal. The European Human Rights Convention, and this is something which I think is important to understand, in Austria is constitutional law, which it's not in France. So by our constitution, everybody has the right to of course everybody has the right to in France, but in Austria the right is not even a normal legal right, but in Austria it's a constitutional right that all these claims and the human rights are dealt with by the courts. And we have to see how these things develop. On practical terms, this leads to interesting consequences. For example, in the last month, we saw a lot of Indians arriving to Austria and claiming asylum. We have no Indian diaspora in Austria. We have no particular migratory history with India. So we found out that hundreds of Indians
took flights from wherever in India with Turkish Airlines via Istanbul to Serbia because they don't need a visa to fly to Serbia. And Serbia is not so far away from Austria. So they arrived completely legally in Serbia and then they traveled north. It took a few months to really see how this whole situation played out, and now Serbia is aligning its visa policy with the visa policy of the European Union, and now Indian nationals coming into Serbia need a visa. All of a sudden, no Indian nationals arrive in Austria. So this is also something which we see that migration policy and foreign policy go hand in hand. If Austria wouldn't have good working relations with Serbia, of course, why would Serbia change its law? Because the reason why Indian nationals could travel visa-free to Serbia was very easy. Serbia supports visa-free travel to Serbia, to every country who does not recognize Kosovo. So, and this is where the situation gets complicated. I think I stopped here.
Well, you've mentioned the Turkish situation. Is Turkish position of using migration sometimes as a way of pressure some governments is vehemently debated in the Council of Europe, and have some solution maybe been discussed?
Well, first of all, Turkey is a member in the Council of Europe and sits at the table. And the Council of Europe is primarily not an organization dealing with migratory issues. I think Turkey has other challenges within the Council of Europe which they have to deal with on their side. But in general, I would say, I think it's not fair to blame Turkey for everything that is not functioning concerning migration in Europe. I think there are a few countries in the wider European area that host more refugees and more migrants than Turkey. If you see how many Syrians are actually living in Turkey, I mean, the numbers are immense. So, and also, so the argument that Turkey is basically just using migrants to influence European Union politics, I think is not really fair. For obvious reasons, Turkey makes the argument, if every migrant who lives now in Turkey moves to the European Union, then what? I think this is also just part of diplomacy, that Turkey wants to make sure that the substantially richer countries of the European Union understand that they also have their share of a burden which the Turkish taxpayer has to take care of. And in my experience, the situation with Turkey is not, of course, easy, but at least there is a rational way of talking and cooperating with Turkey. And I think this is something where the relation between Europe and Turkey, when it comes to this topic, are often better than they look in the media. This is also something probably we want to keep in mind, that because one problem is highlighted on page number 1 of one newspaper does not mean that this is something that really is blown out of proportion, but sometimes the talks between diplomats, between politicians go on a daily basis without problems. With Turkey, for example, in my previous position with the parliament, my president of parliament, he visited the Turkish president of parliament, which is a very high-ranking president in Ankara. So the bilateral relations with Turkey and Austria, between Austria and Turkey and Austria, they are definitely anything but bad. So we really have constructive relations with Spain.
Thank you. To continue with immigration, we can notice that in Italy, Poland, and Hungary, the extreme right has come to power. More globally, there is a big rise of the far right in France, Germany, Spain, or Sweden. Could this trend of global rejection of immigration lead to the closure of the EU on itself?
Again, please repeat the last sentence.
Could this trend of global rejection of immigration lead to the closure of the EU on itself?
I mean, I'm not sure what you mean by, or what you imply by closure, but...
Like she closed their borders.
I mean, first of all, we have internal borders and we have external borders. The external borders of the Schengen area, which I think are the relevant ones you might be addressing. This is really a sensitive topic because the Schengen system was created in a time when we assumed that getting rid of the borders within the Schengen zone is more important than securing our borders towards the outside of the Schengen zone. In today's world, this notion, I think, no longer holds for a lot of areas in Europe. So the question, how do we secure our borders outside, is, I think, of a high relevance, because we want to have free travel and free movement within Schengen. Historically, it has always been the case that if you can travel freely within an area, you have to secure this area towards the outside. And I think we all forget what huge achievement it is that today you just can take the tram and go to Kiel. There is no control. It sounds completely ridiculous that you have to have a passport when you go to Kiel. That you can travel to Luxembourg and to Switzerland, which is not even a member of European Union, but a member of Schengen, without even stopping on the hood. So the way the freedom of movement actually got bigger within Europe is just tremendous. You all belong to a generation where you grew up with this. For you, this is basically normal, and you all had experiences that during the COVID period, how life was basically forever before. That going to Germany or going to other places required some form of permit. Just the pure idea seems ridiculous to you. And that's really good. But just as ridiculous as this sounds, I think we all understand that when we created Schengen, we were in a situation where the Schengen countries were more or less countries which bordered the sea. And to protect the sea, you don't need a lot. You need an echelon, and you need two military or police ships, and that's it. Then you basically have a relatively good control, and you have a coast guard, and that's it. When we enlarge the Schengen area towards the east of Europe, all of a sudden you have a huge land mass which has to be protected. It starts somewhere at the Greek, Turkish, Bulgarian border and runs all the way up to the North Cape and towards the Finnish, Norwegian border. How do we secure land on one side, which is Schengen area, against land on the other side, which does not even want to be Schengen area? And this is a question which, when we constructed Schengen area, was of relevance, because Benelux and France and Germany, they agreed that this is a good idea. And east of Germany, there were other friendly countries, so there was no need to talk about protection of the external border. In today's world, when we talk about migration, but also when we have to agree our Schengen border is with Ukraine, our Schengen border is with Belarus, our Schengen border is with the Russian Federation.
we have to have a certain idea what do we do with this border. And arguing that the situation as it is right now is perfect, I think is not really a way to go forward. So we have to find a way on a European Union level on how to deal with these situations. Because if we don't find a way on the European Union level, every nation will find its own way. And then we have a situation where countries like Poland find a different solution than Estonia, find a different solution than Greece, find a different solution than Bulgaria at the border. And you have countries like Austria who only have Schengen member states who still arrive on a daily basis dozens, if not hundreds of migrants who crossed through Schengen countries, which leads to legal questions. How do you cross a Schengen country arriving in Austria without ever being once controlled? And how did you enter? And these are all questions I think politicians want to have an answer because our citizens want to have an answer. So the position of Austria, I think, is really, we have to find a way in controlling our border, but again, controlling meaning the outside border of Schengen, but controlling does by all means mean not closing. I think nobody wants to close the border to the Ukraine, or nobody wants to close a border completely to other countries, but control and closure are definitely not the same things, but knowing who comes in and knowing who comes out, I think is nothing which is unheard of expecting. Everybody who ever flew out of an airport knows that everybody wants to know who is on the plane. So I think if we want the same thing from people arriving and departing the Schengen zone, this is something that Europe should be possible to offer.
And our final question will be about the Frontex program. Austria supports this program, but can you explain maybe to the students how exactly does it work and what is exactly Austria's position about it?
Okay, in all honesty, I'm anything but an expert on Frontex. Yeah? The challenge with Frontex again has to do with the question of securing the border and on the ground, but also making sure that countries have the legal and practical competences of doing it the same. So we were a strong supporter of making Frontex more capable, of making sure that Frontex is used. But again, we also understand that Frontex had its legal problems, which have to be rectified. But this comes back again to the point, we all think that in Austria, that if we find a solution on a European Union level together with Frontex, which is an agency of the European Union, is way better than if every country is forced to invent something by itself, just because there is no European Union agency who has a mandate on doing that. So we all know that Frontex, it's not like, I don't know, it's not a border guard like in the US or in other countries, and I think we don't want to have it this way. But we really want that Frontex is in a position to support members who have a challenge with money, with personnel. So Austria supports Frontex with experienced personnel out of our police and gendarmerie corps. And I think Frontex is very much needed, but Frontex also has to play by the rules. And we all know that what Frontex does sometimes is it's very difficult, because this is also something, migration policies is something which at the very end, we always have to be very clear that we talk about people. We don't talk about certain numbers and anything, but migration and border management means that somebody who works in all our name stands at one point and says yes or no. And if he says no, this has consequences. And so this is something we all have to understand, that these are functions that are very difficult, that are often at the border of the legal system. And yeah, we also want to make sure that if decisions are taken by Frontex, that they are done in accordance with the law of the nation and the member states of the European Union, and in accordance with all the human rights law of the court in Strasbourg.
Well, thank you very much for your answer, which allowed us to, I think, better understand the working of the Union and the working of Austria also. Now I think we can move on to the questions of the Assembly. Does anybody have some questions?
Thank you very much for your presence here. So Austria hosts the headquarters of the IAEA. It has never possessed nuclear weapons, proposed to launch a nuclear program, nor joined a military alliance like NATO, for example. So Austria also signed and ratified the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons on January 2021. So all of that to underline that Austria is probably one of the global leaders in the efforts towards the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Here's my question. With the war in Ukraine and the proof that, in fact, conventional war is still a very, very real threat, has Austria's position on nuclear weapons changed or evolved?
Thank you. Absolutely not. Actually, we don't only ratified it, we were one of the co-inventors together with Mexico of this international convention. And we all understand that this convention, especially with France, does not go down very well. But our point is very clear. I mean, nuclear deterrence, that's a very theoretical concept, because typically if you deter, means you think you can win and you can survive. Nuclear deterrence de facto means if somebody shoots a nuclear rocket at me, I shoot back one at him. And we can play this indefinitely until our stocks are depleted and nothing is left. So, from an Austrian point of view, there is no deterrence, because I deter by destroying, and and a cascade starts, and at the end, two countries have ceased to exist. So, which is why, for us, the concept of nuclear deterrence per se is a very theoretical one. Having said that, Austria is under no illusion that it will change NATO's policies and China's policies and the politics of the Russian Federation. They have been what they are for decades, and they serve these countries, and to change this position will take time, a lot of time, probably. But even, I think the war in Ukraine actually is something, when it comes to this question, which more or less supports the Austrian position. Because even somebody like President Putin and the Russian army, and if you leave all the propaganda away, it seems that until now there has been nothing which shows in the direction of use of any form of nuclear devices, because they know that this has consequences that probably they cannot control. So again, even in a situation like a war, which is not going according to your first plan, it seems that the Austrian position concerning deterrence seems to be right, because apart, I think, from Mr.
Mr. Medvedev, nobody ever mentioned this word. Nobody who wears a Russian uniform has ever mentioned it, so, or at least not to my knowledge. So I think we see absolutely no reason in changing our position when it comes to this. And you mentioned one important part of Austrian politics, foreign politics. It's also when the question of the legal frameworks of various means of war. At the moment, we are dealing with the question: how does artificial intelligence influence war? There are certain types of weaponry which decide autonomous when to shoot and to shoot at what, and this is something which we see very critical. We think that the decision to kill has to be at the end done by a human being, because if artificial intelligence decides to kill or not to kill, that's a very, very slippery slope. And this doesn't say that it's better or worse for the one on the receiving end, but it changes the nature of warfare if we let an artificial intelligence decide this question and not a human being. For us, this is in a way the same. We also, together with Canada, were the country that started the Ottawa Convention, which led basically to a complete removal of anti-personnel landmines from all military stocks. And even substantial military powers stopped using anti-personnel landmines. This was also a convention which was started in the Austrian foreign ministry. So these are things where we are really working on, because we think this is something where we can have, as a small country who has no interest in warfare and has limited capabilities, we can have an added value to the community of nations by showing them what is possible, by convincing them. And the Ottawa Convention was very successful, and with the Convention on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is obviously in Europe has a limited outreach, but if you look at South America and Africa, most of the countries there are, for example, signatories, and so which makes basically two continents more or less nuclear weapons free. So it's nothing. I think we can say it has led to nothing. But yeah, I think you should be optimistic in these questions, but not naive.
Good morning. Thank you for being with us today. I was wondering what was the relationship between Germany and Austria today, and especially in terms of foreign policy issues. Is there a consensus today between the two countries or not? Thank you.
Well, I mean, the relations between Austria and Germany are first and foremost absolutely friendly. They are our biggest trade partner by far. They are the biggest tourism market, the biggest market for all other products and goods and services. We have hundreds of thousands of Austrians living in Germany, so the people-to-people contacts are very intense. So yes, the relations are very, very friendly. But having said that, until the fall of the Iron Curtain, the Austrian policy was looking very much towards Germany, because it was our natural partner, probably not even partner, but our natural country to go to when we had a lot of questions within the European Union, to our Western allies. We shared certain parts of our history, so and also
I always say it, and I'm just making just half a joke. We are shared by our common language, but after our integration into the European Union, after the opening up of the Iron Curtain, our political relation became much more equilibrated with other countries. So there was really a move toward also going politically to the east, have an outreach to Paris, have an outreach to Rome, talk more directly with Washington and more directly with other powers to the east. So I think and this was also very important for the Austrian understanding of what Austria can be and what it can do. I say this from the perspective of an Austrian and who now lives or represents a country which is 10 times smaller than Germany. So you can imagine it's not the relation between Austria and Germany is not a relation among equals. So it's not like if Paris is talking with Berlin. So this is why it really helped Austria to balance its interests after mid-90s and after the accession to the European Union. And now we're sitting on the table, being able to have its own position. So really also I think change the dynamic towards Germany, having membership also within the Euro and Schengen. So just the need to have like a special relationship with Germany is no longer what it has been in the earlier years of our Second Republic, because we are much more integrated into the European Union and have therefore closer integration in everything European. But again, having said that, the relations, no matter what government is in power, remains close, remains very friendly. Of course, as in every relations, you might have certain points that governments tend to agree or not to agree, but that's just politics, and on the long runs, we get along absolutely well.
You mentioned that you have worked in Tel Aviv. Do you think that Austria can be a mediator in the conflict between Israel and Palestine? What is Austria's position on the recognition of Palestine? But most importantly, can Austria take position despite its immergende Neutralität?
I mean, taking position, that's not a problem, because neutrality means you're neutral between, first of all, we're military neutral between two powers who are at war. So, which means in the case of Ukraine, we cannot, for example, we cannot deliver military hardware to Ukraine because they are at war with the Russian Federation. But we, for example, follow the sanctions regime, which Russia is also not happy with because from their point of view, it's not neutral. But our argument is that as a member of the European Union, we have to follow sanctions, so live with it. When it comes to Israel, I was posted to Israel for 4 years, and I got a question about mediation all the time, and my standard answer was, if we are asked, we will have a look at it. I am not a fan of imposing mediation on two parties if not a single party asked you to be mediator. So, to my knowledge, and I'm living and working here in Strasbourg, nobody asked for Austria at the moment to be a mediator on anything in Israel or Palestine. So, I think if the question arises, it will be dealt with. And then, yeah. So, but because living in Israel for 4 years told me there are so many institutions, organizations, and politicians who have the dire need to be a mediator, and typically, I mean, the conflict, it's not a new one, so obviously no mediator so far has been horribly successful.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's nothing which you should get involved if you're not asked to be mediating by both sides. And of yes, neutrality does not mean that we don't have a position when it comes to this. So we have clearly stated so far that we don't accept, first of all, we don't recognize the state of Palestine, but we accept, for example, Palestine and the Palestinian authority having a representation in Vienna as the representation of the Palestinian people. But we, and we also have always made clear that we are absolutely in favor of a two-state solution. So, but we also have made clear that, and this was an achievement of the former Chancellor Kurz, that due to our history, that the security concerns and the safety of the state of Israel is part of the national interest of Austria, because we were horribly successful in persecuting Austrian Jews and horribly successful in making sure that after World War II we didn't offer them the support they were supposed to get. So a lot of Austrian Jews left for absolutely understandable reasons for Israel. So the last thing we can do now, apart from offering restitution, which we did, and offering citizenship to the descendants, what we do is to make sure that they can live in safety and security in Israel. So this is basically the position we are, and I think the position is more or less in line with a lot of European Union member states, but definitely not all. And as you might be aware, that the position of the European Union towards Israel and Palestine is always one of them where achieving unanimity is one of the most complicated foreign policy questions. So.
First of all, thank you for your presence today. I had a question about Austria and its integration in the EU, more especially in terms of your population. There is a general lack of interest among European citizens for European politics. Do you feel that this also exists in Austria, or would you consider there is a stronger interest in European politics amongst the Austrian population? Thank you.
I think unfortunately we are mainstream. So I think the interest for European politics is also limited, but it's also limited because it's not well understood. I think in the Austrian parliament, 80% of its laws have a basis in European law. And this is something a lot of people don't understand, and I'm quite sure it's the same in France. So that there are so many laws that actually are prepared in Brussels and then have to be transmitted into national law, that from the perspective of citizens, these then are national laws, period. It's very hard to communicate that this is something which basically has a foundation in European directive or any other legal instrument the European Union might have. And then also typically, which is just a normal way of doing politics, politicians tend to always blame one level up of where they are right now. And if you're on a national level in any country, it's always a very easy way of saying we did what we can, but Europe forced us to do this or that. So to communicate positively about the European Union is something which I think we all have to do, but which is very, very complicated because a lot of discussions are dealt with in a very technical way. Then they are dealt with in the Coreper, then they are adjoint, and nobody talks about, and all of a sudden it's in the official gazette. and then people in our countries just read that this and that has been done, and everybody's all of a sudden surprised that this is becoming law. So these are things that make it complicated, yeah. So unfortunately, I think coming back to your question, Austria is more or less mainstream and has the same situation that you mentioned.
First of all, thank you for your presence here today with us. And my question would be, what are your thoughts on Germany recently sending or announcing to send Leopard 2 tanks, given once it was one of the most pragmatic countries in how to approach Ukraine's occupation, and how you think this would be affecting the evolution of the conflict?
Well, first of all, the easy part, the last part of the question, I simply don't know, because making predictions about the future is always problematic. And also for the other question, I think as a neutral country who insists on not delivering military hardware and who insists that its constitution, who states that it's neutral, is respected, we should do the same and not tell other countries how they do their national foreign policy. If Germany and France and others decide to do something which is within their legal framework and which their politicians agreed upon and which is welcomed by Ukraine, it's their national decision, and we see absolutely as Austrians that there is a huge consensus on this question by a lot of powerful states of Europe. But I think nobody needs good or bad advice from Austrians when it comes to tanks, because we don't give them, we don't have them, apart from a few for our own army. So yeah, I think this is really something the diplomats from the states that deliver the tanks to Ukraine should answer, and we are simply not a part of this discussion, because everybody knows, and Ukraine also respects, that they don't even ask us for weapons, because they also know our constitution very well.
Thank you for being here. Austria recently joined the Eurocorps programs, so it's a sort of European army. Does it change the neutrality of Austria?
No, not really, because Eurocorps is, I mean, it's just basically exactly that, a corps of soldiers training together, working together, preparing for a possible mission together. And we have a particular status there, and which allows us to work together with other European armies in the framework of the European Union, which is absolutely what we want. Which is also why we are members of the Partnership for Peace and NATO, to allow the Austrian army to have the same or follow the same standards as other armies that are NATO members. So Eurocorps for us is really nothing that has anything to do with neutrality, because and I didn't mention this, when we have neutrality as its ends, when it, first of all, you have a mandate from the United Nations to use force. Then the Austrian army is allowed to go abroad with a UN mandate and use force. But the same is also true, and this is true since we became a member of the European Union, if we have a mandate by the European Union, which is why Austria is together supported together with France an EU mission in Mali. After France, the second biggest contingent in Mali was the Austrian army. So it's hard to argue that this was something done which has any. I mean, you're not neutral. You're a military in Mali, but because we have a mandate from the European Union, we are allowed to send Austrian soldiers with weapons. And the same is true for Eurocorps. Eurocorps is just a way of training, and of setting up certain structures that in case the European Union wants to send, that we are ready to do so. And it goes even further that, for example, in Kosovo there is KFOR, Kosovo Forces, which is more or less a UN mandated operation but managed by NATO. And even it was led by Austrian generals. So we are as deeply integrated into the structures that NATO allowed a non-NATO general from a neutral country leading NATO troops in Kosovo. So these are all things that for us are legally not a problem. And also politically, it's very well understood that we have a national interest in securing the Western Balkans, which is why until today we have a huge contingency in Austrian dimensions in Kosovo and also in Bosnia for security reasons, because they are mandated and we want these countries to be safe and secure.
So thank you to being here. And my question will be, we all know the particular difficulties with Hungary and the EU. What can Austria actually do to regulate this conflict?
I mean, when it comes, we get this question quite often, but honestly, most often time this question implies that because Austria and Hungary, we have a common history and we are neighbors, that there is a special relation, and in a way that anyone thinks that Budapest follows not orders, but listens to what Vienna has to say and takes it more seriously if Vienna tells them a position than if another European country tells them. Let me tell you that from a Hungarian point of view, they are a full member of the European Union, as is Austria, as is France. And if there is a problem which Hungary has with a political topic in the European Union, they deal with it on the topic of the European Union. It's nothing typically where we feel that we have a particular way of convincing them. And there is this Article 7 procedure against Hungary concerning certain aspects of rule of law, and we are firm in our position with most other EU member states that certain things in Hungary have to change. And so there is it's not that we are a little bit in between the bigger part of Europe and Hungary, but when it comes to this rule of law questions, our Ministry of Justice, our Ministry of Constitution, when they are in Brussels, they vote with the majority. So I think even if the historical relations are definitely there, the national politics of Hungary, they are made in Budapest, and they listen to us to the extent they listen to Paris or to Berlin or to any other neighbor they want to listen to, but that's about it.
Hello again. I'm maybe getting a bit off track then of the security challenges. So Austria is the first European country to have implemented the eco-social tax on greenhouse gas emissions as part of a 2040 net zero target, which is more ambitious than the European aims. It has also allocated 59% of the recovery and resilience plans to support climate objectives. We all know the importance of energy transition and reducing the carbon footprints, and it seems as though Austria is being pretty assertive and is definitely ahead than the majority of the European countries on that topic. So, you explained the importance of the Austrian neutrality and the seats of the power it gives you, maybe in terms of soft influential power, or maybe the injunctions that are received in more polarized countries. How does Austria perform in the Council of Europe on the matter of climate change? And do you think that in regards to everything that I said before, you maybe have a role to hold in terms of leading or promoting climate transition?
I mean, what you say is absolutely true, which probably has to do with the fact that this government consists of the Conservative Party and the Green Party. So, for obvious reasons, the Green Party, who also has the Ministry for the Environment, of course, there is a particular interest in this question on the very top of the government. And I'm sure this helps to fulfill certain fields that other countries might deem it's okay if you fulfill it, but we don't have to over-fulfill it. But when it comes to the Council of Europe, and I'm now here for 4 months, it's my experience that the topic of climate change is something which is always on the table, but not as a topic per se, but it's something that is included in the SDGs, which the Council of Europe also tries to include into its programs and conventions. It's something, when it comes to Ukraine, was huge in the last parliamentary assembly, because the question of how do wars destroy nature and environment and the habitat for human life is something which is of huge relevance for the Ukrainian delegation. Be it that the question of if you put on landmines in a country, farmers can no longer farm. When you destroy wells, they can no longer be used. When you drill new wells and you have too many of them, the level of the water goes down to a level which is no longer sustainable. So the effects of war on human rights is a topic which is of huge importance for the Council of Europe. But it always comes through the lenses of democracy, human rights, rule of law, because these are the 3 main topics the Council of Europe is dealing with. And yeah, of course, Austria there has the same positions as in its national positions, meaning we want to see these things followed through. Another very concrete examples we were having, there are huge discussions in Austria about the protection of the wolf. In Austria, this is a very heated debate. Certain regions in Austria, they want to be allowed to shoot certain wolves that are deemed problematic in their behavior. But the Ministry of the Environment supports the position that the wolf is a protected species and cannot be shot. So this is an open question. A lot of people think this is a European Union directive. No, it's not. It's the Bern Convention, which it was done here in Bern, but it's a convention of the Council of Europe. And this is something which is very true in a lot of fields, that a lot of things are, this is not your question, but a lot of things are actually based on conventions of the European, of the Council of Europe, and not of the European Union, but they are seen in our member states as that's European Union law, when in reality this is something completely different which was done here in Strasbourg. The same goes, for example, which might be a little bit more of relevance to you, the question of how your notes and exams and attestations at the end of your studies are accredited to in other member states. That's not a law that was written by the European Union, but this is something which is done here in Strasbourg in the Council of Europe. And then the European Union only took over and one-on-one, so that also within the European Union people can move with their attestations and exams without any hindrances.
Thank you very much, Andreas Lins, for your presence. It was a real pleasure to receive you here. Je pense qu'on peut l'applaudir encore une fois. On se retrouve à 14h au Parlement. Respectez bien les horaires d'arrivée et bon appétit.
On va la boucle. Ah, c'est